Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. And I am back again with Hank. And we are continuing our Church Fathers series. We are starting a new Church Father, Gregory of Nyssa. We did his older brother, Basil the Great, for the last couple episodes. But now we're moving on to Gregory of Nyssa. And I have to say, I think that Gregory of Nyssa is one of the most brilliant and interesting people that we have covered so far. So I was wondering what your initial impressions and reactions were, Hank.
Well, we know Gregory of Nyssa he's a Cappadocian brother, born about 335 AD, died about 364 AD.
Not
Um,
364, 396, I think.
394.
394. 394. Yes. Let
We're
the
both
record
wrong.
show. Yes.
Okay. Um, he was actually um, he was actually very much um, influenced by Origen.
Yes, I think that's true.
Okay.
It's not like he's unwilling to disagree with Origen. He does disagree with Origen a couple times, specifically in the book that we're about to talk about. But he is very absorbed and very influenced by Origen. That's very true.
Yeah. And so I think that he's he certainly did not have the administrative chops that his brother Basil had. So he was more of what you would call professorial. Um,
And quiet, bookish type. I get the
yep,
impression, and
yep,
mostly more like to keep to himself. Whereas Basil liked being sort of in the arena and playing the religious political game.
yes. With Basil, you have a lot of letters to a lot of people with influence, chiding them or thanking them. But a um, he was definitely the kind of guy that was far more in the public eye. Sort of the if you think about it, the Attenborough brothers, one was an actor and the other one was more into animals and a TV presenter, but the one that was into animals, you wouldn't know him. He wasn't as famous as his brother. So,
Right.
yeah, Basil was the more probably infamous one for quite a while, or famous one. But as time goes on, I think in the 20th century, um, a lot of academics,
Gregory, yeah.
yeah, started, especially someone like Father John Behr.
Yeah, and so I do think that Gregory is getting more attention now than his more famous older brother because he spent more time on theological writings and his theology. I do think he's a little bit smarter and a little bit sharper and has a more interesting writing style than his more famous older brother. So just to sort of recap some things, this is like the most famous Christian family of all time. Their parents were devout Christians. They grew up in Neo Caesarea in Pontus, which is what we would call north central Turkey. This family had 10 children, four of which have been canonized as saints in the Orthodox and Catholic Church. And I couldn't quite figure out what Gregory was in the birth order. I think he's like third or fourth. And I think there's one child in between Basil and Gregory, but he's sort of right there in somewhere in the middle of these 10 children. And whereas Basil was sort of like the favored older brother who got the scholarship to go study in Athens, we don't have any evidence that Gregory ever left home for education. But his father was a rhetorician. Basically, a rhetorician is pretty similar to what we would call a professor, and sort of a little bit like a lawyer, too, maybe, but they would go around and speak in public and stuff like that. And so in the late 350s, Basil the Great falls under the mentorship of a guy named Eustathius, who was a very sort of extreme ascetic Christian. He preached celibacy for all Christians, full equality between the sexes. He taught abolitionism, that is the elimination of slavery, in the 350s. And he was an extreme ascetic, like, really hardcore fasting, kind of being a hermit by yourself and that sort of thing. And Basil sort of brings this influence into the family. And the older sister, Macrina, who is also an extremely fascinating lady, she turns the family homestead into like a quasi-monastic center with, sort of places for learning and places for being a hermit, but also places for taking care of pilgrims, and almost like a kind of an introductory hospital sort of thing. And their parents agree to set free all of their slaves, and so they kind of practice abolition in their own family. But unlike his siblings, Gregory gets married to a lady named Theosebia, although there's some dispute at this. Some sources seem to think he didn't get married, but most of the sources I read seem to think that he did get married. So he probably wasn't as into this extreme asceticism that some of his older siblings were. And this is, back when he's a teenager, right, that this sort of influence is coming into his family via his older brother. But a little bit of, just sort of church politics background reminder. In 360 AD, their bishop of Pontus signed the Council of Sirmium Confession, which was a Arian creed. And this sort of really angered Basil and probably Gregory too, that their bishop was sort of siding or compromising with the Arians. But that same year, Constantius, who is the emperor who had called that Arian council, dies of fever. Julian the Apostate becomes emperor. Then Julian the Apostate dies fighting the Persians, and Jovian becomes emperor. But then Jovian dies the next year of smoke inhalation in a tent in 364 AD. And then after Jovian, the empire is split in half between Valentinus and Valens. And Valens rules the east, and so the Cappadocians are in the eastern part of the empire, and Valens, who's their emperor, is pro-Arian. And after this, Basil starts writing against Eunomius. And so they're being a little bit risky because the Cappadocian fathers are writing against Arianism, even though they're under an Arian emperor. And so in 370 AD, their bishop dies, and Basil sort of organizes a quick kind of group of people to get Basil anointed as the new bishop, perhaps not even following all the proper procedures to do so. But hey, occupancy is 99% of the law in any case, and so he becomes bishop. So Gregory's older brother is bishop. And in 371 AD, Valens, the emperor, visits Caesarea to visit Basil. And Valens has already killed or put a lot of pro-Nicene bishops and monks on boats, and those boats don't reach their destination and stuff like that. So he has a murderous reputation for killing anti-Arian bishops and church people. And Basil is sort of the most prominent and famous anti-Arian in Valens's land. And so Valens coming to visit him is a potentially very scary situation. But he listens to a church service led by Basil, and he sees sort of the hospitals and the charity works that are going on in Cappadocia, and is overall very impressed by Basil's both his eloquence and his organizational skills. And so he decides not to punish or persecute Basil the Great. And so that was a very close call for their family. But then what happens is the next year, he still decides to shrink the basically the size that Basil is in control of. So he takes Basil's bishopric and splits it in two and gives Basil sort of the smaller part to sort of weaken his geographical power. But then what Basil does in response to this is he subdivides his land even further to make room for even more bishops, and he appoints his brother Gregory of Nyssa as one of those bishops. Basically, it's sort of like stacking the Supreme Court, right? If the other side is adding more seats to their side, you add more seats to your side to improve your power balance. So you can see these are the sort of political games that Gregory's older brother is up to, but that's how Gregory becomes a bishop. And you kind of get a sense that Gregory didn't want to do this and that he feels sort of put up to this by his brother and that he's getting dragged into these political fights that he doesn't really care to be involved in. And it's also potentially dangerous to his own life, as we sort of already discussed. But anyway, Gregory is appointed Bishop of Nyssa. And later on, Gregory gets accused of embezzlement and other crimes by these anti-Nicene bishops and the emperor. And I would suspect that these crimes that he's accused of are false accusations. I don't think there's really good evidence that he did these things. But he is removed from his bishopric in 376 AD. But in 378 AD, the Emperor Valens dies and is succeeded by Theodosius the Great, who is a pro-Nicene Creed emperor as opposed to a pro-Arian emperor. And Gregory is welcomed back to his bishop post in Nyssa in 378 AD. Just a little bit later in 378 AD, the Basil the Great, his older brother, dies just after the Emperor Valens dies. And Basil the Great had written a text called the Hexameron, or On the 6 Days of Creation, which is something that Hank and I had talked about previously. And at the end of that work, Basil ends by saying, regarding what it means that humans are created in the image of God, I have much to say, but we can't cover that now. And that was one of the last things he wrote before he died. And so Gregory of Nyssa then takes up the challenge and he writes the book that we're going to be covering today, On the Human Image of God, or sometimes it's called On the Creation of Man, which talks about what it means that humans are made in the image of God. And he's picking up the torch of the last thing that his older brother wrote and finishing that work. And he gives it as a Easter present to his younger brother. So I'm sure, Hank, in your family on Easter, you often write long theological treatises to each other as your Easter gifts for each other, right? That's what you guys do?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's what we do in my family. Yeah, Christmas, Easter, theological treatises as presents, but it kind of gives you a sense of what sort of family this was. But then after that, Gregory of Nyssa is at the Council of Constantinople in 381, the big one that writes the creed that people still recite today. But he doesn't seem to enjoy being in the spotlight or in the power place. And he does some stuff after that, but it seems like his favorite thing to do is to write theological treatises and mostly be left alone. And he takes care of his bishopric, but he mostly just enjoys being with his own people and not causing much of a fuss. And he eventually dies in 394 AD. But that's a biography about Gregory of Nyssa. There's a lot of gaps in it, honestly, that we don't know, that I'm a little bit surprised of. But the main thing that we're going to be covering today is On the Human Image of God. But did you have anything that you wanted to say, Hank, about Gregory's biography before we move on to the book?
No, I mean, I think we're going to discuss why he has become more prominent in the last 100 years than some of the other church fathers because of the um, interesting subjects he tackles in his writings and the way that he approaches them.
Yeah. So this book is called On the Human Image of God. I'll just say, so I've already talked with Father John Behr about this book, but he has an excellent translation that he just released on the Human Image of God. And it's pretty good and really readable. It's a little complicated, but there's a really good introduction by Father John Behr, which is enjoyable. But I still think, even though I talked with Father John Behr about it, I still think that there's some things that I still kind of want to discuss and get off my chest about this book that I didn't get to cover in my discussion with him. But Father John Behr points out how Gregory of Nyssa is really influenced by a couple key things in his writing of this book. He's very influenced by Origen, as we've already discussed. He's very influenced by Philo of Alexandria, who's a Jewish commentator on the Jewish books, but Philo of Alexandria is writing in Greek and is sort of combining Greek philosophy, especially Middle Platonic philosophy, with Jewish exegesis. And that sort of combination of Platonism and Jewish tradition is something that really influences Gregory of Nyssa. But another thing that's very interesting is that it's very influenced by Plato's own book, why am I forgetting the name? Well, the Timaeus, that's what it is. So Plato's book, the Timaeus, is Plato's creation account. And so Plato goes through and does a philosophical job of trying to describe how he thinks creation came to be. It's sort of like his book of Genesis. And Father John Behr points out that this book by Gregory of Nyssa has basically the same format as Plato's Timaeus, but it has a Christian content to it, almost as if it's a correction and a modification of Plato's own book. So it's very influenced by Plato, but he's also directly criticizing and writing against some of Plato's ideas by presenting a Christian version of the work instead of a pagan version of the work. So I thought that that was sort of an interesting thing that Father John Behr noticed. But anyway, I want to go right into a quote, and I feel like the question is the main question of the book is quite simple. What does it mean that humans are made in the image of God? What's the image of God, and how are we to understand this, and what does that mean for us? So here's the first quote that I'm going to read. The divine beauty is not in being adorned with a certain shape or excellent form, but is contemplated in unspeakable blessedness in accordance with virtue. Painters convey human forms in their pictures by means of certain colors, applying to their copy the appropriate and corresponding tints so that the beauty of the archetype may be accurately transferred to the likeness. So also, as I understand it, our fashioner also, painting the image to resemble his own beauty by the addition of virtues, as it were, with colors, shows in us his own sovereignty. Manifold and varied are the colors, as it were, by which his true form is portrayed. So I think there's this sort of constant tension in this book. If God is sort of formless and can't be seen and doesn't, say, look like anything in particular, what is it made for us to be in God's image? Because how can you make an image of something that doesn't have a particular shape or appearance if God is beyond shape and appearance? And he understands our human image to be in basically in forms of virtues and in forms of our abilities and our mental faculties and stuff like that. And so it's basically our behavior and our ability to understand truth that is our image of God, and not, just sort of the way we look. So anyway, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that quote, Hank.
Well, I think the thought is we can dig a little deeper, which is another quote sort of plays off this. Why man appeared last after creation? That's the nature of man is more precious than all visible creation. That the construction of man throughout signifies his ruling power. That man is a likeness of the divine sovereignty.
Right. So it's our ruling power that is another manifestation of us being in the image of God,
Right.
but not just necessarily the shape of our bodies or the appearance of our face, but the function that we're playing within creation.
Which plays to sacramental theology, that in all theology, I would hope, that Adam was the first great high priest. He had sovereignty over the garden, that he named the animals, which was an act of sovereignty. So I think Gregory sees that and says that being made in the image of God isn't so much a form, I believe, as it is a function.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, here's another quote that sort of summarizes some of the main points of the book really well. This is from chapter 2, paragraph 9. I also think there is a contemplation of this particular point. closer to nature, by which one may learn something of more refined teachings. For since the most beautiful and supreme good of all is the divinity itself, to which incline all things that have the desire for the beautiful, we therefore say that the intellect, as being in accordance with the image of the most beautiful, as long as it partakes, so far as possible, in the likeness of the archetype, also remains in the beautiful. But if it were somehow to be outside this, it will be stripped bare of the beauty in which it was. And just as we said through that the intellect was adorned by the likeness of the archetypal beauty, being formed as though it were a mirror by the figure of that which appears in it, so we consider that the nature administered by the intellect possesses something of the intellect in the same portion, and that it is adorned by the beauty issuing from the intellect, such that it becomes, as it were, a mirror of a mirror. By it, the material element of existence in which nature is contemplated is ruled and sustained. So, what does he mean by this mirror of a mirror business? It's basically this idea that God has his sort of foreknowledge or knowledge in his head. In other words, God himself has an intellect. There is the divine intellect where eternal truth is, and basically the plan for all of creation has already sort of happened, or at least been pre-planned in God's mind. And that's God's own intellect. And we have an intellect ourselves that can sort of contemplate the things of God. And so long as we're thinking about the things of God in heaven, our own intellect has the same beauty or reflects the same beauty as God's own intellect. But if we use our intellect for bad things and contemplate earthly things or evil things as opposed to divine things, then our intellect can sort of lose the beauty that it has naturally been adorned with. And so if our intellect thinks about the things of God, then it is a mirror that shines forth the reflection of the original intellect, which is God's own mind. And so I think that's basically what he's saying with that. So again, this emphasis, the strong emphasis that our likeness to God is our intellectual power and ability to understand and contemplate sort of divine truth.
So, and he goes further by saying, look, man is a blending of the divine and earthly, right? That gives means by which he may naturally and properly be disposed to each enjoyment, enjoying by means of his more divine nature and good things of earth by the sense akin to them, right? So, a lot of times we call that God number one, God number two.
Mm-hmm.
And Gregory of Nyssa is saying basically what was around for 1,500 years of Christianity were a combination of the divine and the earthly, and that they shouldn't be in conflict. They should be working together, and they really be, in my estimation, with the Enlightenment, they became in conflict.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think there's this really beautiful idea in Gregory. I won't read the quote, but for him, basically, when humans are doing good things, the good things that we do is when we contemplate divine truth and eternal forms, and that comes into our mind through our intellect, and then we use our body to help bring that about in creation. So
Right.
imagine like you have an idea to, build a fancy rocket that will take us to Mars, right? And Elon has this idea in his head of how it should work. And that idea is true as long as it conforms to the true image of what a rocket should be, sort of in God's mind. And we use our mind to contemplate the best that we can, the eternal truth, and then use our bodies as instruments of our mind to bring it into reality. And in that way, we're sort of like this conduit of how the eternal intellect, the mind of God, enters our mind and then enters creation. And that's our role as human beings, is to be the conduit through which God's goals and purposes and design comes into creation, because we can, with our intellect, understand his intellect and make it happen. But we can
Right.
fail to do that too. It's not just like a given that
Right.
humans do that. We can use our intellect to focus on bad and ugly and evil things as well, and that's how evil can come into the world, is if our intellect is put to bad purpose as opposed to good purpose. And it's up to our own free will. He's not particularly Calvinist in this. He very much believes in the autonomy and authority of our own free will, and that is how we can use our will for good or for evil.
And he uses the term, well, he doesn't say free will as much as he says cooperation.
Yeah.
Okay. Which is something, if you're in Orthodox or Catholic Church, they'll teach that God works with us in cooperation with us, meaning not against us, right? Where I think there's this uh, the term I think uses irresistible grace. Whether you're cooperating or not, you're getting it.
Yeah.
Okay. And Gregory of Nyssa would say, no, that's not how it works, because he has a higher view of man, right? His view of man is very high. He goes, but man's form is upright, extends aloft towards heaven, and looks upward. And these are the marks of sovereignty which show his royal dignity, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so he has a much higher view of man, even in his fallen state, than what we would see normally from, I think, a Western, well, more of an American evangelical Christianity, which is such a mishmash of different ideas. So,
Yeah.
which is a lower view of man's. Basically, we're sort of doomed, and we're wretched.
Yeah. So here's a statement that he has about human fallenness that I thought was interesting. This is from chapter 18, paragraph 6. But since the tendency to sin is heavy and bears downward, the opposite more often happens. For the governing principle of the soul is dragged downwards by the weight of the irrational nature, much more than is the heavy and earthly element raised up by the loftiness of the mind. Therefore, our wretchedness often causes the divine gift to be unknown, spreading the passions of the flesh like some ugly mask over the beauty of the image. So, if you remember, Martin Luther is sort of famous for saying that humans are sort of like snow on top of a dung heap, right?
Oh,
That
God's grace is snow on top of a dung heap.
Right. That inside us, we're like sort of, poopy,
Right.
right?
Yep.
Deep down, we're poopy, but God sort of washes over that. And it's not that Gregory of Nyssa doesn't have a view of human fallenness or thinks that we're just perfect and honky dory, but he thinks that what part of the problem is that because our minds are sort of lofty and light and our bodies are heavy, it's often easier for the heavy part of us to drag the mind down as opposed to the lofty part of us, our minds, to drag our body and our passions up, which is the way that it's supposed to work. So because of that tendency, bad things often happen. And instead of our intellect, using our body to spread the will of God in the world, our body and our passions use our intellect to spread sin into the world. But even still, it's an ugly mask that covers over the beauty of the image. So still deep down, he thinks that we're really good on the inside, but there is this negative tendency that often obfuscates and covers that over. But this is something that can be fought against and that we can still make moral progress in the right direction if we understand this tendency.
Well, that would be basically a teaching of becoming more Christ-like, right? Okay.
Right.
Right. So, I mean, we still hear that today, that Christians should always become more Christ-like, like, finding, identifying sin, confessing that sin, and turning away from that sin, and becoming more like Christ. So again, that would presume that we have something within us that would make us more like Christ. And Some would say, well, that's the Holy Spirit that makes you more like Christ. Of course, Sam, you might have a problem with that.
Why would I have a problem with that? That's exactly what I think.
Oh, okay, good. And only God could make us more like Christ. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, so the Holy Spirit is God at work in us.
Yeah, a separate.
Not that separate. Not that separate.
So, anyways, the idea though is there's this high idea of man. Okay, and I think it's from reading the Old Testament. It's certainly reading Genesis, and again, Origen susses through those first 3 chapters of Genesis. And I'm sure if he sussed through it and Gregory studied Origen, Gregory sussed through it. And I think you look and say, hold it. We were given sovereignty. We were given rule underneath the divine sovereign, which would imply that we have artifacts or part. We are good. God, as a matter of fact, when God made man, He said Mazel Tov, which is very good. So, the idea again, we can go back to Athanasius. The one thing that you might like, God became man so man could become God. It's a high view of man is going to become like God, which we still have in our American evangelical Christianity, which is that we will be perfect when we meet with God, right? We are perfected. Well, what does that mean? If we're perfected, that means we're like God because God is perfect. We can't be something less than perfect to be with perfect, right? That means we become God in the sense of imperfection, not maybe in sense of sovereignty or in the sense of omniscience, but in the sense of our perfection, we become like God. So the interesting thing is that we read throughout his thing that he basically, he keeps on going about God. Let us make man in our image after our likeness. How mean and unworthy of the majesty of man are the fancies of some heathen writers, right? And I would take that today. When you break down, man to basically propositions and scientific knowledge, right? What's funny is when you do that, I think there's somebody saying if you don't believe in God, one will be chosen for you. So
yeah.
Okay, so I think it's a very interesting. He's an interesting writer in the sense that he finds he gives man. He has that high view of man is something that you can see through his family how they treated people, right? That high view.
Right.
Okay. So it not only has an esoteric, philosophical, theological implications, right? It now has a practical implication of really creating. His family created the first hospital, maybe the first YMCA. The older sister creates the first hostel, right? That creates all these integrated things that the emperor comes and says, I'm impressed. We're not going to kill you.
Yeah.
Right? Because the emperor
and they
says,
even freeing slaves, right? That connection between the liberation of humans from slavery is deeply connected with their deep view of what it means for humans to be made in the image of God.
It's slavery back then wasn't the chattel slavery that we think of that the United States had with our African American brothers and sisters, right? This was a lot of times people themselves said, I want to be your slave because they couldn't eat.
Right.
Okay. They didn't have a place to live. So, hey, look, I'm I'm all in on you telling me what to do as long as I can have 3 square meals a day and a place to sleep with a roof over my head.
Mm-hmm.
So it was more of a interactive type of odd. We wouldn't even recognize it today.
Yeah, it was basically servanthood with a non-cash salary or something
Right.
like that, and maybe a contract period. But even that they thought was unbefitting. So another subject that I want to talk about in this book that I think is just absolutely fascinating is that Gregory has what I would call a very I'm going to try and use this word carefully, progressive view of creation. In other words, that creation is supposed to progress, to move in a progression from simple things to higher things. And that part of the reason why there's creation at all, part of the reason why there's time, part of the reason why God has given so much time for things to happen the way that they've happened, is that it's a maturation process and a perfecting process. And that he views this as happening at multiple levels simultaneously. Yes, every human is supposed to be a progression towards perfection, but it's also an individual human's progression towards perfection that helps make all of humanity a perfect image of God. And Gregory is quite clear that the image of God also refers to two things simultaneously. It refers to an individual person who's made in the image of God, but also all of humanity is a collective body that is the full image of God. And so it's not just that Hank is the image of God and Sam's the image of God, but all humans together form the body of Christ as a unified collective. And that itself is an even more image of God thing than an individual, because we're supposed to be sort of a cooperative, unified body.
So would that
And that
make him a universalist?
I do think it's fair to say that he's a universalist. I'm not the only one who says this. It seems like the internet mostly agrees that he's a universalist, but he does seem to think that all humans will eventually be saved, some through baptism and some through fire. And you should choose baptism over fire. It's a much easier way to go. But one way or another, God's going to get you. And that part of this is so we're going to perfect individual humans. When we perfect individual humans, we're also perfecting the corporate body of all humans together. And by doing that, then we perfect all of creation. And the way that God dwells all in all is he perfects humans, perfects the body of humanity, perfects all of creation through that. And it's this progressive tendency from simple to higher that is sort of the purpose and the narrative of all of creation.
Did he get any pushback in his day from?
Probably, I
Right.
assume so, but I'm not aware of. I mean, obviously, he was hunted by Aryans to try and be,
Yeah,
killed or
but
sidelined,
that's a,
but that
yeah,
was over something else. Yeah,
that's over Christology. That's not
right,
over
right,
salvation.
right.
Um, I I guess what I keep on finding interesting about our early church fathers, right, is there's parts of their theology that you would say are sound sniffy or heretical, right?
Yeah,
And yet again, I'm going to speak as a Catholic. I don't understand why Origen got the Denver boot. Why did he got kicked out? Because quite frankly, given some of the early church fathers and their saints, and we have feast days for them, right?
mm-hmm.
And I'm saying we should. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm just saying, gee, you got a guy here who basically until Augustine came hopping through was the guy that all the early church fathers were looking at and critiquing or expanding.
Yeah, yeah. An interesting thing that Gregory will disagree with from Origen is he has a section where he is talking about when does the soul come into being, and there was sort of three views that he's arguing or considering. There's the view that souls existed up in heaven before they were put in bodies and then come down according to their, fealty to God. And he disagrees with this. And he says, some have written in a book called On First Principles that this is what happens. And Hank, do you happen to know what book he's likely referencing when he says on first principles?
Oh, he's referencing Origen.
Right. And so he's disagreeing with his, he admires Origen a lot. And there's a lot about Gregory's own theology that's very similar to Origen. But he specifically disagrees with the idea that souls come down into bodies from some pre-existent higher heavenly realm. And then there's another view that the body's created first, and then the soul only comes to exist sometime later, perhaps at some developmental stage. And he says, no, I think that the body and the soul are intimately connected, and they must begin at the same time and have the same duration. And so therefore, a human being comes into existence at what we would call conception, and that the soul must come into existence contemporaneously with the body and is always united with the body. And that he suggests that, I'll just say, something of the male contribution to the reproductive process must have within it an animation that then is the source of animation and or the soul of the fetus within the human. And so he would certainly say that the human soul begins at conception, as opposed to afterwards or before, as Origen might suggest. So that's one of the few times that he clearly disagrees with Origen. He doesn't say Origen by name, but when he says on first principles, I think it's pretty clear.
He doesn't have to say it by name. It would be like me disagreeing with C.S. Lewis on Mere Christianity, saying the author of Mere Christianity said X, and I say Y.
Yeah.
Although, again, Gregory of Nyssa's argument has far more cogency than Origen in this area, which is, and basically, it's a good teaching, because how can you just intermediate the soul and the body? As a matter of fact, Christian teaching is that when we finally are resurrected, it's resurrected new glorious bodies, right? You can't separate the two. And even in his writing saying, hey, we have this ability to have a divine interaction with God plus enjoying the earth, right? It's not an either or, it's a both and.
Right. And Gregory also doesn't think that our embodiment is bad or wrong.
Right.
Whereas Origen seems to think that our embodiment is a consequence of our disembodied soul failing to adhere perfectly to God. And it's not quite a punishment, but sort of like a negative natural consequence of our lack of faith in our pre-embodied state. Whereas Gregory seems to disagree with Origen, not just on when our souls come into being, but about how good bodies are in the first place.
Yeah.
And our bodies are designed to be the sort of instrument. He often uses the analogy of a musician playing an instrument, that our soul is the musician who plays the instrument of our body, and that our body is fitted well to our purpose. Like you mentioned, we have an upright stature so that we can look up at God. You quoted that earlier. He also has a long paragraph or chapter even about hands and fingers, and how hands and fingers are the sorts of things that can write and make stuff. And that is also emblematic of our purpose, is to be the sort of being that can do that sort of thing. And that our bodies are fitting to the purpose of rule that God gave to us. So he has a positive view of the human body compared to some other Christians who might have a more negative view of the human body.
Correct. And again, Origen tap dances right near Gnosticism.
Yes, right? I think that's fair. I think that's a fair accusation.
And so, and Gregory of Nyssa has a far more doctrinal, and could be that the position that we hold today on the interaction of the soul and body that we find doctrinal is developed by Gregory of Nyssa.
Yeah. There's also a really interesting section where he talks about passions. And it was very common in Platonic philosophy to view the passions as evil in and of themselves, and that God, therefore, doesn't have passions and is beyond passion. And the goal is sort of to extinguish your passions, because this body with its passions is constantly sort of dragging down the soul and making it icky with passions. And Gregory of Nyssa, his view is like, passions can be used for good things or bad things. It depends on the way that they're put to use. If the intellect is in control of the passions, then the passions are good. For example, he talks about fear as a passion. And he's like, if you handle fear badly, it can make you a coward. And that is wrong. And that's sort of like your passion ruling your intellect. But if your intellect interacts with fear properly, it can make you prudent and cautious in a strategic way. And he goes through a whole list of passions and talks about what the negative version of the passion is, but also a positive version of what the
Right.
passion is. So it's not that passions in themselves are wrong, it's how they are directed. And that the goal is to use our intellect to inform the use of our passions to put them to good purpose, and not that the passions themselves are wrong. And that's very different than a lot of Platonic philosophy and Gnosticism that views the passions as something simply to be escaped because they're inherently icky in and of themselves.
So again, when we know that Neoplatonism is a big deal within, even today, within the church, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So we read the Old Testament and we see that God is passionate, right? You're not going to see the promised land for 40 years because you guys have messed with me too many times. I've had it with you, right? I mean, I'm simplifying it. But we see Jesus is very passionate. He wept. He cleared out the temple. Jesus wasn't Spock,
Right.
right? He had passions. But we would say, or Gregory would say it's unto the intellect. We would say it was under the Spirit, right? The Spirit of God is the one that we want to control our passions. And then, yes, passion for justice, a passion for protection, right? A passion for righteousness. All those passions are good passions. We don't want to be an emotionalist.
Right. So I will add an asterisk to this, though, because
Okay.
there is something very interesting when he talks about male and female, right? He spends a large time figuring out what exactly do we make of the fact that humans are made male and female. And is the image of God male and female? Well, he says, of course not. The image of God is neither male nor female. It's beyond and above gender, because God doesn't need to reproduce, and male and female are for the purposes of reproduction. And I do think that it's fair to say here, I'll read a quote and then kind of discuss this. All right. So, while two elements, the divine and incorporeal nature and the irrational and animal life, are separated from each other as extremes, the human is the span. For there is to be beheld in the human compound a share of each of those mentioned, of the divine, the rational, and intelligent, which does not admit to the difference, I should say, of male and female. Of the irrational, the bodily formation and construction divided into male and female, for each of them is certainly in all that partakes of human life. So, in a certain sense, he's saying the image of God is in men and women alike, right? Both of them have that sort of rational intelligence to them. But he's also saying that this male and female thing, like, where did it come from, right? The division between male and female is not in the prototype of God's image, but is from the less rational nature. So it's basically our bodies that have this division between male and female, and not the image of God that has male and female. So why is it that we're made male and female? So he who brought all things into being and modeled the human being as a whole by his own will into the divine image did not wait to see the number of souls made complete in its proper plentitude by the gradual addition of those subsequently coming to be, but considering the human nature as a whole in its plentitude by the activity of foreknowledge, and honoring it with an allocation exalted and equal to the angels, since he foresaw by his visionary power the will not keeping a straight course towards the good, and because of this taking away from the angelic life, in order that the multitude of human souls should not be cut short by falling from that mode by which the angels increased to a multitude. For this reason, he formed in our nature that device for increase appropriate to those who had slipped into sin, implanting in humanity, instead of the angelic nobility, the animal and irrational mode of succession from one to another. All right, so this is a dense quote. I'll unpack this a little bit. So, one of the really interesting things of Gregory of Nyssa is that he thinks that God knew ahead of time exactly how many humans there's going to be, and that the building of the human body, right? I talked about how there's the human image at the individual level, and then there's the human image at the level of all of humanity. That God is building the human body, all of humanity, that is, one soul by soul, and that he has a fixed number that he has in mind that is sort of the complete number of all of humanity. He doesn't say what that number is. He just says that God knows that in his foreknowledge. So God knows that he needs to, instead of creating all of the human beings at one time, he creates them one by one, and that they need to grow in number. And he talks about how the angels have a way of multiplying that we don't know or understand, right? There is a whole host of angels in heaven, and he doesn't think that God made all of them at once, but that they grew in number from some sort of, smaller number. And so the angels have some form of reproduction. We just don't know what that form of reproduction is. So why don't humans reproduce the way that angels reproduce if we're in the image of God the same way the angels are? And he says that God in his foreknowledge knew that we would stray from the straight course of towards the good. And so because God knew that we would stray, and therefore that we couldn't reproduce in the angelic way, that he gave us the animal way, the irrational way of reproducing one after another. And so the angels aren't male and female. They reproduce in some asexual way that we don't know. But because that we would not be perfect, he gave us the animal way of reproduction. And so some people say that Gregory thinks that we only became male and female after the fall. And I don't think that's quite right. It's that God knew that the fall would happen. And so therefore he designed us ahead of time, knowing that we would sin, to be able to reproduce in the animal way as opposed to the angelic way. And so that's another interesting point, that he thinks that God knew that we would fall. But anyway, there's a lot in that paragraph. Any thoughts, Hank?
There is a lot in that paragraph. A lot. And reading it again, right? It's so foreign to how we think.
Yeah. We don't think about angels we don't think about angels reproducing.
I think, those are things that don't come up in any Christian thought at all, right? Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, what might come up is, what are the functions of certain angels, like Saint Michael, or Gabriel, or Raphael, those angels that are named in Scripture. But I don't think that the idea of angels replicating in some way is a thought that many theologians or Christians have had over the years.
Yeah, and he will also say that in our resurrected bodies we will not have gender. And this is not unique to Gregory. Afrahat,
Right.
if I remember, said the exact same thing, and I think that other church fathers have said this too, that our resurrected bodies will be agender. So for all of those people out there who view themselves as the sexuality of agender, maybe they're just anticipating their future heavenly state.
Non-binary.
Yes, we'll be non-binary in our future resurrected state.
But we are binary right now.
That's true.
Yes. And I think the other thing is, those church fathers are working off of something where Jesus says, there will be nobody being married or given in marriage,
and they will be like the angels in heaven.
Right. So they sit there and read that and say, well, then they'd be asexual, right?
Mm-hmm.
C.S. Lewis disagrees. They'll just be more of what they were on Earth. They'll be in eternal glory and be more a man or more a woman, but in a perfected state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
one last topic that I want to cover with
yep.
Gregory of Nyssa in this book is what's the relationship between the mind and the body? Because he has this idea that our souls are the span, right, that can connect heaven to earth. There's
Okay.
the divine sort of aspect of us that can use intellect and contemplation and that sort of thing. And then there's this animal part of us, our lower soul, our vegetative soul, our animal soul, and our bodies. And that the soul sort of connects these two things. But that sort of leaves open the question of how exactly does our soul or our mind interact with our body? And he actually spends a fair amount of time asking that question. I think that's interesting because David Bentley Hart wrote a new book, like, what is it? The World is Full of Gods, I think is the title of David Bentley Hart's new book. That's sort of a Platonic style dialogue between different characters. And it's basically trying to answer the question of what's the connection between our soul and our mind and our bodies. And this is a question that we still don't feel like we totally understand very well in this day and age, right? An atheist might think, well, your mind just is your brain doing stuff. But then it's like, well, what's consciousness and how is our brain conscious and where does that come from? And what's the relationship between consciousness and the world around us? And why, this is a question that we still wrestle with. And this is something that Gregory spends a fair amount of time wrestling with in this book as well. So here are a couple quotes related to that subject. And just as if there were some large city receiving those coming in by different entrances, all will not congregate at the same spot in some place in the city, but some will go to the market, some to the house, others to the churches, or to the streets, or lanes, or theaters, each according to his own inclination. I see some such city of our intellect, distinguishing and examining each of the things that enters and stores them in their proper department of knowledge. And I thought this was just an amazingly insightful quote about how we think of our minds working. Like, I recently watched Inside Out and Inside Out 2 with my kids. And right, you see them putting memories in different places of the
Right.
mind and different parts of the brain and stuff like that. And it's like a city basically inside your mind. And then I read this, and I was like, holy smokes, Gregory of Nyssa has the same idea 1600 years ago, that our brain or our mind is like a city with different things coming and going and belonging in different places.
But that would actually sound like Dawkins,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's all about rational apprehension and putting things together, but that's incomplete.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So this, so I assume that he'd have more thorough going idea of how
Yeah.
that works than just a sort of a Dawkins-esque sort of flat view of the world.
Of the mind. Yeah. So
Yeah.
here's another quote. We should say only that the conscious and sound activity of the mind should be referred to the intellect. As the fantastic nonsense that occurs in sleep, we suppose that some appearances of the activity of the intellect are accidentally fashioned from the last rational form of the soul, being released by sleep from the senses, also by necessity comes to be outside the activities of the intellect, as it is through the senses that the mixing together of the intellect with the human being takes place. And he says dreams are various phantasms relating to the body and the memory affecting the lower or the vegetative part of the soul. So he thinks that we have different parts of our soul, that there's the vegetative, which is sort of how plants are animated, right? Like a plant can move and takes care of itself and has energy and stuff like that. We would call that metabolism and the various activities of the cells within the plant. So also our soul has the vegetative function. And then animals have a vegetative function, and then they also have the animal function, which is sense perception, right? Like an animal can hear and can smell and can see and responds to their outside stimulus, but it doesn't have the rational part of the soul. Only humans have the rational part of the soul, but humans also have all the lower functions too. We have a plant soul, an animal soul, and a rational soul. And so what he's saying is when we sleep, it's like the plant part of our soul sends these images and memories into the intellect, and we think that it's the intellect doing something, but it's actually from the plant part of our soul. And I thought that that was strangely similar to like Freud's subconscious or something like that.
Right. So the id, the
Yeah.
ego, the superego, right?
Right.
You
Yeah.
know, uh,
All right. And so I've got one more quote that sort of ties all these things together in terms of mind and body. The communion of the intellectual with the bodily is a conjunction, unspeakable and inconceivable, neither being with it, for the incorporeal is not enclosed in a body, nor yet surrounding it from the outside, for the things incorporeal do not surround something else, but the intellect approaching our nature in some inexplicable and incomprehensible way and coming to touch it is to be thought of as both in it and around it, neither seated in it nor unfolded with it, but in a way which we cannot speak or think, except this, that will nature prosperous according to its own nature, that will nature prosperous according to its own order, the intellect is also active, and if any misfortune falls the former, the movement of the mind halts correspondingly. So at some level he thinks that it's a mystery and that we can't really say exactly how this works, how the intellect interacts with the body. But he doesn't want to say that the intellect is inside the body, but nor does he want to say the body is inside the intellect, but they're like perfectly cotemporaneous or something like that. And that he doesn't want to give sort of preference to either, but it's sort of some unspeakable conjunction that he doesn't really know exactly how it works.
sort of like consciousness.
Yeah. So he kind of punts to mystery, you could say, and doesn't give
Well,
some final explanation.
as we do with consciousness, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah.
It's so 1700 years later, we're still right.
We're still in the same unspeakable mystery. Yeah.
Correct. We just use different words, different
Right.
analogies, metaphors. Um, but yeah, it's. I think we know we have an intellect. We know we're conscious. We just don't know how we got there. You know,
Yeah.
and we don't know the wherefore and why. And so, of course, we go back now. You know, we Christians say it's a mystery, and what's funny is watching, say, people are thoroughgoing materialists. Dawkins and Harris try to explain it more in rational ways, and yet they get caught in conceptual confusions all the time,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And because sooner or later you have to go back to a foundation we're conscious, and we just don't know how we are.
Right.
We just
And
don't know,
and
and we
is
don't. Yeah.
does consciousness control the body? Does the body make the mind conscious? What and he doesn't want to go in either of those two directions, but sort of keep a balance
I'll
between
go
them.
to either. It's both.
Yeah.
It's both, right?
Hmm.
You can't separate, right? I mean, I trust me. I have a bulging disc. There's times where all I'm thinking about is my body, right?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. There's other times when I'm in, everything's just fantastic, and I'm thinking of some conceptual idea or some kind of thought or phantasm, you could say, right? It, the interconnection of the two is so you can't pull one out from the other, and the idea that you
Yeah.
can is reductionist on either end. Um, and as a Christian, I would say that what it does is it takes away the sacred mystery of how we were made by God.
Right.
And even, I'll leave with this, Gregory brings that up, that we're not made, God is imageless. He doesn't have, we would say he is his essence. He is the essence of all things. He's the undergirding of everything, right? He's not someone we compete with, but he's also not someone that looks like me or looks like you.
Right.
Okay. And so, and that's why we see in the Old Testament that there is no idea that you could see God. No man has seen God and lived. Right. Okay.
Hmm.
So yeah, I get why he's testing it out, but I mean, yeah, at the end, what he does is he throws up his hands like everybody else and says, "Hey, I've got no answer for you. And
Yeah.
you know what? This is as far as I'm going, and I've got something better to do today. So leave me alone."
Yeah. All right. I've got one last quote that I think
Okay.
is really pretty phenomenal. And now that we've built up the foundation of all these terms and stuff, I think that we can finally understand this quote. And I think this is what we'll close with. But it seems to me that by these points, Moses reveals a certain doctrine about hidden things. And he's talking about the first chapter of Genesis, and secretly delivers the philosophy concerning the soul. So there's this secret teaching hidden inside the early chapters of Genesis that's actually about the soul of humanity, which outside learning also imagined but did not clearly comprehend. Through these things, the account teaches us that the vital and animating power is contemplated in three divisions. One is simply growth and nutrition, supplying what is suitable for the increase of those being nourished, which is called vegetative and is contemplated in plants, right? That's the plant soul I was talking about. For one can perceive in growing plants a certain power of life without a share in sense perception. There's another form of life besides this, which has both that one and adds regulation by sense perception, and it is the nature of irrational animals. For not only are they nourished and grow, but they also have the activity of sense perception and apprehension. The perfect embodied life is seen in the rational, and I mean the human nature, which is which both is nourished and endowed with sense perception and partakes of reason and is ordered by intellect. For this reason, the human being was fashioned last, after plants and animals, nature advancing in a certain way sequentially to perfection. So just as the human being sort of grows from a vegetative baby to sense perception to a full grown adult, so in all of nature is there a progression from plants to animals to humans. And I think that even though he's like not describing Darwinian evolution, a Darwinian evolutionist could look at this and be like, yeah, he's completely and totally right. And the kind of closing sentence, thus remarkably, nature makes the ascent as it whereby steps. I mean the properties of life from the lower to the perfect. So all of creation is growing towards the human, and the human itself grows into its own perfection, and all of humanity grows into its own perfection. And that's this very progressive vision that I was talking about, that there is this purpose for everything to become like God,
Yep.
and we become like God so that God can be in creation through us.
Right.
Yeah.
So, for those of you who believe in New Earth creation, I will put we'll get you a safe space for this part that we just did. Um, so, this is it's an interesting. Um, it's very interesting. It predates Darwin by about 1,500 years.
Yeah.
You know, if Darwin read this, he would sit there and go, "That makes perfect sense."
Yeah. And if Gregory were to read Darwin, he would be like, yeah, makes perfect sense. That's about what I was trying to say. Thank you for helping me articulate it.
Right. Hey, you just you did something a little different than I did, but yeah, it's interesting the confluence of thoughts at times.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so this was good. I think again, I look forward to some of the comments, but this was not on Christology so much as it was on.
Yeah.
Uh,
And this book talks almost nothing about Christology. There are a couple sentences here or there.
yeah,
I was expecting it to be about Christology a lot. I was like, there's almost nothing in here that a Unitarian wouldn't agree with, or couldn't agree with,
yeah,
I should say. He spends actually surprisingly little time talking about Jesus, I would even say, in a book about the human image of God. And I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was absolutely
yeah.
remarkable. I think it's one of the most remarkable books we've read in this whole series.
It is. And like I said, I look forward to interacting with people in the comments to see if they can even flesh out some of the things we discussed more so.
Yeah. And so our next time we'll be also doing a Gregory of Nyssa book called The Life of Moses. And he basically uses the life of Moses as an analogy for our soul's ascent to heaven, basically,
Yep.
or the growth of our own soul. And you can see in that last quote that nature is making its ascent towards God. And he
Right.
uses the life of Moses as an analogy for how we mature as Christians and make our own ascent towards God. And so
Right.
that's our teaser for next time.
Sounds great.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Thank you.